The cold that settled over the Caribou Mountains in the last week of November was not the kind that merely chilled. It was the kind that thought about you, that found the gaps in your clothing and worked its way through, methodically, like a debt collector, who knew you had nothing left to give and intended to collect anyway. Nora Pelletier had been trying to ignore that cold for 4 days. She sat with her back pressed against the hollow base of a fallen Douglas fir, her 23-year-old body burning calories she didn't have, trying to generate warmth from nothing but determination and the 2 thin blankets she'd wrapped around her daughters. Bess, who was 5, had stopped asking questions 2 days ago, which frightened Nora more than the cold did. Maisie, who was 8, and had inherited her father's stubborn streak along with his blue eyes, sat upright with her chin jutted forward, staring into the gray wall of the snowstorm, as though she could outlast it through sheer contempt. "Mama," Maisie said, without looking away from the snow. "The fire's nearly out." Nora already knew. She'd been watching the last orange ember shrink for the past hour, calculating. The way she'd been calculating everything since the morning she drove their truck through the gates of the Pelletier property for the last time, with nothing but her daughters and a cardboard box of winter clothes. She'd been calculating the whole 300-kilometer drive north. She'd been calculating when the truck's rear axle snapped on a logging road, 22 kilometers from the nearest town. She'd been calculating when the temperature dropped 14 degrees in 6 hours and the snow started falling sideways. The numbers had stopped working in her favor somewhere around midnight. "I know, sweet girl," Nora said. Her voice didn't shake. She'd decided somewhere in the last 24 hours that her voice was not going to shake in front of her children. It could shake later, when this was over, when they were somewhere warm, and Bess was asking questions again, and Maisie was fighting with her about something ordinary. It could shake then. We'll manage. She didn't believe it, but she said it. The truth she kept folded tight behind her sternum was this. They were not going to make it through another night in the open. The last of their food had been 2 granola bars split 3 ways the previous morning. Bess's breathing had developed a new, wet quality that Nora recognized from the winter Maisie had bronchitis at age 3, and that recognition sat in her chest like a stone. The logging road was buried under 40 centimeters of fresh snow, and the GPS on her phone had given up sometime yesterday afternoon. She had run because she had to. She was still sure of that much. Dominic Pelletier had built his version of a life the way some men build traps, carefully, patiently, so that by the time you understood what it was, you were already inside it. He'd married Nora when she was 19, and he was 34, which had seemed like sophistication at the time, and looked like something else entirely in hindsight. His family owned 300 acres of timber country outside of Prince George, along with a sawmill, a gravel operation, and enough goodwill from local officials to ensure that complaints from a young wife went nowhere interesting. By the time Nora understood what nowhere interesting meant, she had 2 daughters, no credit history of her own, and a husband who had very clear ideas about where she belonged and what happened when she tested those ideas. She had been planning to leave for 8 months. She'd been saving crumpled 20s in a hollowed-out shampoo bottle under the bathroom sink. She'd been calling her cousin in Kamloops from the landline at the feed store in town because Dominic checked her cell records. She'd had a plan. The plan had not included Dominic finding the shampoo bottle 3 weeks before she was ready. It had not included the look on his face when he held it up and shook it at her, the bills fanning out onto the kitchen floor. It had not included grabbing the girls in the middle of the night with whatever she could carry and driving until the road ran out, and now the road had run out. Nora was pulling Bess tighter against her side, trying to share what warmth she had left, when Maisie's posture changed. The girl went very still in the particular way she had, animal still, every sense sharpening at once. "Mama," Maisie said quietly, "there's something out there." Nora had heard it too. A sound beneath the wind, rhythmic and deliberate. Not an animal. Too even, too purposeful. Boots in snow, breaking a trail with the confidence of someone who knew exactly where they were going. She pulled the girls behind her and picked up the iron stake she'd been using to tend the fire. It wasn't much. It was what she had. The figure that appeared at the edge of the tree line was enormous, or seemed that way, backlit by the flat white glare of the storm. A man, bundled so heavily in Carhartt and wool, and a canvas work coat that he looked less like a person and more like a geographical feature. He stopped when he saw them. He didn't come closer. He stood there for a long moment, reading the situation with the unhurried patience of someone accustomed to making assessments in difficult terrain, and then he raised both hands away from his body, slowly, so she could see them. "I'm not going to hurt you," he said. His voice carried easily through the wind, deep, measured. The voice of a man who didn't waste words because he understood they had weight. "I saw your smoke from the ridge, followed it down." Nora didn't lower the stake. "Who are you?" "Name's Sutton Hale." He still hadn't moved. The snow was settling on the shoulders of his coat in thick white ridges. "I run a trap line up here in winter. Got a cabin about 2 kilometers northeast. Solid walls, stove, firewood. It's yours if you need it." He glanced at Bess, who was pressed against Nora's back, and something shifted in his expression. Not pity, exactly. Something more like recognition, as though he understood, in a way that went past words, what it meant to be cold and small and out of options. "Your little one," he said, his voice dropping. "That cough, how long has she had it?" 2 days, Nora said, and her voice did shake then. Just slightly, just the once. Sutton Hale lowered his hands. He looked at Nora directly, and she looked back at him, and she made the calculation she'd been making about everything for 4 days. She dropped the stake. "Maisie," she said, "come hold my hand." The walk was brutal in the way that things are brutal when you've already been through too much, and your body's run out of reserves, and every step costs more than you have. Sutton went ahead, breaking the trail through thigh-deep snow with legs that seemed improbably powerful for a man moving at the steady pace he maintained. He carried Bess inside his coat, the girl's head tucked under his chin, and the sight of her small face against all that worn canvas did something to Nora's chest that she didn't have a name for yet. He didn't speak much. He pointed out where the ground dropped, where the ice was uncertain, where to place her feet on a steep section of trail. He waited without impatience when Maisie's boot came off in a drift, and they had to stop and wrestle it back on. He simply waited, scanning the tree line, giving them all the time they needed. The cabin appeared through the snow like something Nora's exhausted mind might have invented. A low, broad building of squared logs chinked with mortar, tucked into the lee of a granite outcropping so naturally that it might have grown there. Smoke rose from a stone chimney. Light glowed at the window. Inside, the warmth hit them like something physical. Pine smoke, and the iron smell of a wood stove, and something else, something that might have been dried cedar. The cabin was a single room, spare and methodical, a bunk bed along one wall, a work table, shelves of carefully organized gear, a cast iron stove that radiated heat in waves. A man's space, orderly, solitary, built for function. Sutton moved directly to the stove, adding wood with practiced efficiency. He produced blankets from a cedar chest without ceremony, thick wool, smelling of clean cold and lanolin, and handed them over. He didn't look at Nora while she stripped the wet clothes from her daughters and wrapped them by the stove. He stood with his back to them and put a cast-iron pot on to heat. "Elk broth," he said. "Made it yesterday. It'll warm them from the inside." Nora dressed her girls in the dry, oversized wool socks and flannel she found in the bundle he'd set beside them, and then she sat on the floor beside the stove, with Bess in her lap and her back against the warm iron, and she felt the cold, which had been her entire world for 4 days, begin to loosen its hold. She was crying, she realized, silently, tears sliding down her face without any drama, while Maisie inspected a pair of snowshoes on the wall, and Bess had finally mercifully stopped coughing. Sutton crouched beside Bess with a tin cup of broth and spooned it carefully into the child's mouth. His hands, which were enormous and scarred at the knuckles, were gentle in a way that seemed entirely natural, as though he'd always had them. "The congestion in her chest," he said quietly, not looking up from Bess. "I've got dried yarrow and wild ginger. I'll make a steam for her tonight. It'll help clear it." Nora watched him. "Why are you doing this?" He was quiet for a moment. He set the cup down and rested his forearms on his knees, looking at the stove. "Because it's the right thing to do," he said, and the simplicity of it was so complete that Nora had nothing to say in response. He handed her a cup of the broth. She drank it too fast, and it didn't matter. "Mrs. Pelletier," he said. He said it without turning. "You don't have to tell me anything." Nora set the cup down. She looked at his profile, the clean angle of a jaw that hadn't seen a razor in several weeks, the flat, patient set of his eyes looking into the stove's amber window. "How did you know my name?" she asked. "Your truck," Sutton said. "I found it on the logging road about 4 hours ago. Went looking because fresh tracks don't just stop. The registration was in the glove box." He paused. "There was also a man on a snowmobile about 2 kilometers south of your truck, stopping at intervals, looking at tracks." The broth went cold in Nora's stomach. "He's been out there since this morning," Sutton continued, his voice unchanged, moving in a grid. "The snow's been covering the trail fast enough, but if it slows down by morning, he'll pick it up again." Nora pulled Bess closer. "That's my husband. I figured he'll come here. He knows these mountains. His family's been logging this country for 40 years. He'll find us." Sutton turned and looked at her then. His eyes were a deep gray-green, the color of lichen on granite, and there was something in them that was very old and very still, like looking at water that runs very deep. "Let me tell you something about these mountains," he said. "They're mine. I've been living on this trapline for 11 winters. I know every game trail, every ridge, every creek bed in a 30-kilometer radius. Your husband knows the logging roads." He picked up the broth again and handed it back to her. "Drink that." Nora drank. The rest of the evening settled over them like something cautious, feeling its way carefully. Maisie, who trusted nothing, had begun watching Sutton with the focused attention she usually reserved for things she was trying to understand. When he showed her how the trapline maps worked, the hand-drawn grids on oilskin paper, the coded symbols marking territories, she asked questions in the rapid-fire way she had when she'd found something genuinely interesting, and Sutton answered them all with complete seriousness, as though her questions were the most reasonable thing about his day. Nora sat with Bess asleep across her lap and watched this man she had known for 3 hours teach her daughter how to read a terrain map, and she felt something loosen in her chest, something that had been wound very tight for a very long time. "You've done this before," she said later, when the girls were asleep and the stove was burning low, and they sat across from each other at the work table with cups of chicory coffee between them. "Taken care of people." Sutton looked at his cup. "I used to be a paramedic," he said. "Northern BC Air Ambulance. 12 years. What happened?" The silence that followed was not uncomfortable. It was the silence of a man choosing how much to say and deciding to say the truth. "We lost a family," he said at last. "Father, mother, 2 kids. Weather delay. Should have gotten to them an hour earlier. Didn't." He looked at the stove. "I stayed in the job 2 more years after that. Probably should have left sooner. Came up here eventually. The mountains are honest. They don't pretend to be anything other than what they are." Nora traced her finger along a scratch in the tabletop. "Dominic's family owns half the timber rights in this district," she said. "His brother sits on the municipal council. The RCMP detachment in Mackenzie, the corporal there's been to our house for Christmas dinner 3 times. She looked up. "I filed a report 8 months ago. The responding officer told me that family matters were complicated and suggested I think about whether I was being entirely fair." Sutton looked at her steadily. "There are other detachments," he said. And there are federal investigators who don't go to anyone's Christmas dinner. I don't have proof of anything beyond my own word. You have 2 daughters who've been dragged through the wilderness in November because you were afraid to stay, he said. Not harshly, just plainly. That's the beginning of proof. The stove clicked and popped. Outside, the wind had begun to ease, which was what Nora had been afraid of. When the wind stopped, the snow stopped. When the snow stopped, the tracks from 4 days ago would become legible again to anyone who knew what they were reading. She was thinking about that when Maisie's eyes opened from her bedroll near the stove. Mr. Hale, Maisie said, with the complete absence of social preamble that characterized 8-year-olds everywhere. Someone's outside. Sutton was already moving. He went to the window, a narrow rectangle set high in the logs, and looked for a long moment. Then he came back to the table, and something had shifted in him. The careful stillness remained, but underneath it something else had come online, something focused and cold and entirely calm. Snowmobile? Stopped at the edge of the tree line. He's on foot now. Sutton looked at Nora. How does he operate? Does he escalate fast or slow? Nora thought about the shampoo bottle, about the look on Dominic's face. Fast, she said. Once he knows, there's no point in pretending. Sutton nodded. He went to the cedar chest and removed a flare gun, which he set on the table. Then he pulled his own cell phone from a jacket pocket and handed it to Nora. There's a number saved under Constance, he said. She's a sergeant with the Federal Serious Crimes Unit in Prince George. We did a wilderness training course together 8 years ago. She is not from here, and she does not owe anyone in this district anything. He met Nora's eyes. Call her. Tell her you're with me. Tell her all of it. What are you going to do? I'm going to go outside and have a conversation, Sutton said, pulling on his coat. Your husband is trespassing on a registered trapline. That's a Wildlife Act violation. I'm going to explain that to him very clearly. He won't listen. Most people listen, Sutton said, when they understand exactly where they are and exactly who they're talking to. He picked up the heavy flashlight from the shelf by the door. Lock this behind me. Don't open it unless you hear my voice. He went out into the dark. Nora locked the door. She made sure the girls were still asleep. Then she looked at the phone in her hand for a long count of 5, and she pressed call. The woman who answered had the wide-awake voice of someone accustomed to calls at strange hours. Sutton, she said. No, Nora said. My name is Nora Pelletier. Sutton Hale told me to call you. He said to tell you all of it. She paused. Her voice was steadier than she expected. So I'm going to. Outside, a man's voice rose sharp and angry in the dark, and Sutton's answered it. Low, unhurried, the same tone he'd used to explain the terrain maps to Maisie, the same tone he'd used to tell her about losing the family in the mountains 12 years ago. Nora pressed the phone tight against her ear and listened to the sergeant on the other end, asking clear professional questions, and she answered every one of them. It took 45 minutes. By the end, the voice outside had stopped. When Sutton knocked, she knew it from the rhythm. 3 times, a pause, then once more, which she realized after a moment was something he had simply done, some instinctive courtesy, so she would know it was him. She opened the door. He was alone. He brushed snow from his shoulders in the doorway, unhurried. He's gone? She asked. For now. He didn't think I knew who his uncle was on the district council. I explained that I'd been reading that particular family's logging violations for a decade and would be genuinely delighted to share my files with anyone interested. The ghost of something moved across his face. Not quite a smile, but its predecessor. Turns out a man with a well-documented interest in your husband's family's compliance record is less appealing to threaten than a woman alone. Nora looked at him for a long moment. You have files. 11 winters is a long time, he said. A man needs a hobby. Nora laughed. She hadn't expected to. It came out of her in a short, startled burst, and she covered her mouth with her hand, and Sutton looked at her with that expression that wasn't quite a smile, but was clearly adjacent to one. The sergeant, he said. She's sending 2 investigators up from Prince George in the morning. They'll be here by midday. I know, she told me. Nora stepped back from the door to let him in out of the cold. She said she'd been looking for a way into Dominic's family's business for 3 years. Something about a timber licensing scheme and evidence that kept getting misplaced. She paused. She said my statement, combined with what I can tell her about his operation, things I overheard, things I saw, might be exactly what they needed. Sutton came inside. He stood by the stove and held his hands over the heat. Were you scared? He asked, not of Dominic, of telling it. She understood the distinction. Yes, she said. I've been scared for a long time. She looked at her daughters asleep on the floor, Bess's chest rising and falling without the wet rattle it had carried for 2 days. Maisie with her chin still jutted stubbornly even in sleep. I'm less scared now than I was this morning. They sat across from each other at the table again, coffee long gone cold between them. The stove burned. The cabin was very quiet. You left a life, Sutton said, not a question. I left a trap, Nora said. There's a difference. He looked at the table. The old scar at his knuckle caught the light from the stove. You know what I keep thinking about, he said. All those years in the air ambulance. The people we got to in time. Not the ones we didn't, the ones we did. The ones who made it because someone showed up. He picked up the cold coffee cup and turned it in his hands. I forgot for a while that those people existed. That showing up sometimes works. Nora looked at him across the table. This man she had known for 6 hours, who had carried her sick daughter through a blizzard and stood in the dark between her family and the thing that had been pursuing them for years. And she thought about how strange and specific the arithmetic of survival was. How many things had to go wrong in a particular sequence, and then one thing had to go right. Sutton, she said, thank you. He looked at her with those lichen-gray eyes. Don't thank me yet, he said. Thank me after the investigators come and the statements made, and you and your girls are somewhere warm and safe with better options ahead of you than behind. Then I'll thank you then, she said. Fair enough, he said. Outside, the wind had died completely. The snow had stopped. The mountains were very still. The way they get after a storm passes through and takes all the noise with it, leaving behind only the profound crystalline silence of a world that has no interest in being anything other than exactly what it is. In the morning, the sun came up over the Caribou Range in long flat bars of gold across the white, and Maisie was the first one awake, standing at the high, narrow window on her tiptoes to see it. Bess woke next, coughing once, twice, and then breathing clear, and the relief on Nora's face was the kind that doesn't require any words. Sutton made oatmeal from his stores with dried blueberries that Maisie ate with the focused appreciation of someone who had been very hungry and was not going to take the blueberries for granted. He showed her the trail the elk made coming to his salt lick in the night, pointed out in the fresh snow below the window, and she traced the shape of the prints with her finger against the glass. The investigators arrived at 12:42, 2 of them, both from Prince George, both with the particular efficient courtesy of people who have driven 4 hours through difficult roads and are prepared to work. They set up at the table and they listened, and Nora talked for 2 hours and 17 minutes. Beginning with a timber meeting she'd accidentally overheard 8 months before her marriage ended, and working forward with the precision of a woman who'd been storing these details in her body for years, waiting for someone with the authority to use them. What came next took months, as these things do. Dominic's family had lawyers who were good at their jobs and a great deal of experience navigating inconvenient truths. But Nora had 2 investigators who had also been waiting, who had files of their own, and who found, in what she gave them, the particular piece they'd been missing. She and the girls stayed in Prince George through the winter in a furnished apartment arranged through a victim services coordinator the sergeant had referred them to. Nora got a job in a physiotherapy clinic as a receptionist and found, to her own surprise, that she was exceptionally good at logistics and less afraid of difficult people than she used to be. Maisie started at a new school and declared her teacher fine, which was high praise. Bess stopped coughing by December. Sutton drove down from the trapline in March, which was when the logging roads became passable, and sat across from Nora in a coffee shop on the main street of Prince George with a cup of coffee between his hands, looking slightly out of place in a population center, but not unhappy about it. "How are the girls?" he asked. "Good," she said. Bess started drawing again. She went through a phase where she only drew mountains. "I think it's processing," he smiled then, a real one, and it changed his whole face. "And you?" Nora thought about the question seriously, the way she'd learned to take serious things seriously. "I'm building something," she said. "I don't know what it is yet, but it's mine. That's new." He looked at her across the table with those patient gray-green eyes. "That sounds about right," he said. Outside, the March sun was working on the last of the Prince George snowpack, and the streets were full of the particular muddy optimism of a northern city remembering that spring exists. Inside the coffee shop, two people who had each separately survived, losing everything they thought their life, was sat across from each other in the warm and discovered, with some surprise, that they were in no particular hurry to be anywhere else.